My family forgot me after my wife died. I cooked, called, and waited 7 years. Not one person showed up. So I sold the house, closed all my accounts, and vanished. A year later, I received a call that would make me rethink everything I knew about blood and betrayal. My name is George Bennett. I am 75 years old, and for a very long time I lived as a ghost in my own home. Standing in my formal dining room on a crisp November afternoon, I looked down the length of the long mahogany table. It was perfectly set for 12 people. The fine silver was polished until it gleamed. The crystal wine glasses caught the golden afternoon light, pouring through the bay windows, and the heavy linen napkins were folded exactly the way my late wife Evelyn had taught me. The smell of roasted turkey, fresh sage, and warm buttery rolls filled the house, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket of memories. It had been exactly 7 years since Evelyn passed away. When she was alive, this house was a fortress of laughter, warmth, and family. Since her heart stopped beating, this house had become a tomb. For 7 consecutive years, I had hosted every major holiday. For 7 years, I had woken up at dawn, marinated the meats, baked the pies from scratch, and waited by the window. And for 7 consecutive years, my son Justin and my daughter Nicole had failed to show up. There was always an excuse: a delayed flight, a sudden illness, a massive work crisis. I always forgave them. I always packed up the leftovers, put them in the freezer, and ate alone in the quiet kitchen, telling myself that they were just busy, successful adults building their own lives. As I stood there staring at the beautiful, untouched feast, a profound sense of exhaustion washed over me. I reached out to grab the edge of the large platter, finally ready to admit defeat, and throw the cooling turkey straight into the garbage. Suddenly, the silence of the house was shattered by the sharp ringing of my cell phone in my chest pocket. I pulled it out and saw Justin's name flashing on the screen. My heart gave a pathetic, hopeful flutter. Maybe they were just running incredibly late. Maybe they were just pulling into the driveway right now. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear, a warm greeting already forming on my lips, but I didn't get the chance to speak. There was no greeting on the other end, only the muffled sound of fabric rustling, followed by the clinking of heavy glass and the loud echoing acoustics of a crowded high-end room. It was a pocket dial. Justin had accidentally called me without realizing his phone was unlocked. I was about to hang up when a voice cut through the background noise, sharp and clear. It was my daughter, Nicole. She was speaking loudly, her voice dripping with annoyance. "I don't even care, Justin," she was saying. "Just let the old man eat alone again. I'm not spending my holiday listening to him talk about Mom or his glory days at the shipping company. It is depressing." I froze. The breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. I set the phone on speaker and with my free hand started a voice memo on the iPad lying beside the place settings. Then I stood paralyzed in the dining room, listening to my own flesh and blood dismiss me as a pathetic nuisance while every word was preserved. Then Justin's voice responded, loud and shockingly cold. "Look, we need him isolated anyway," Justin said, his tone casual and calculating. "If he thinks nobody else is looking out for him, he will be more compliant." The lawyer said, "We just need him to feel dependent. Once I get those conservatorship papers pushed through next month, we can finally dump him in that state-run facility upstate. The one that doesn't ask too many questions." A sharp ringing sound filled my ears. My hand began to tremble so violently that I almost dropped the phone. A state-run facility. Conservatorship. I listened, trapped in a waking nightmare, as my son continued to outline my demise to his sister. "It is going to be seamless," Justin bragged, presumably taking a sip of whatever he was drinking. "We get him declared mentally unfit. I take over as legal guardian. Then we immediately liquidate the house and his entire $8 million stock portfolio. We pay off the debts, and we are clear. He is so desperate for us to visit, he will sign anything I put in front of him. The old man won't even know what hit him until they lock the door to his ward." Nicole laughed. A sharp, cruel sound that I did not recognize. Make sure you get the signatures before Christmas, she replied. I am not spending another year waiting for this inheritance. The line suddenly went dead. The phone beeped, signaling the end of the call, but the silence that followed was deafening. I stood perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the empty chairs around my dining table. The world spun dangerously around me. My children, the babies I had rocked to sleep, the teenagers I had put through expensive universities, the adults I had loved unconditionally, had just put a price tag on my sanity and my freedom. They were not just ignoring me. They were actively plotting to lock me away in a miserable institution to steal my life's work. An hour passed. I sat in the dark living room staring at the blank television screen, letting the shock run its course through my veins. The betrayal burned like acid in my chest. Then exactly 60 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was Justin. I took a deep, steadying breath, forced my facial muscles to relax, and answered the call, modulating my voice to sound frail and gentle. Hello, Justin, I said softly. Dad. Oh my God, Dad, I am so incredibly sorry, Justin exclaimed. His voice was a masterclass in theatrical panic. He sounded breathless, stressed, and dripping with fake sincerity. We have had an absolute nightmare of a day. I was driving down the interstate to come see you, and the SUV's transmission completely gave out. We were stranded on the shoulder for 3 hours waiting for a tow truck. I closed my eyes, listening to the smooth, practiced lie pouring out of my son's mouth. Oh, son. That is terrible, I replied, injecting just the right amount of grandfatherly concern into my tone. Are you all right? Is everyone safe? It gets worse. Justin sighed heavily into the receiver. The stress of being stranded triggered one of Nicole's severe migraines. It was so bad we had to call an ambulance. I am sitting here in the waiting room at the hospital right now. We are absolutely devastated that we are missing Thanksgiving with you, Dad. We wanted to be there so badly. The audacity of his performance was breathtaking. Less than an hour ago, I had heard him laughing about throwing me into a state ward. Now he was playing the role of the devoted, heartbroken son trapped in a sterile emergency room. Don't you worry about me at all, Justin, I said, making sure my voice trembled just a fraction. Family health comes first. You just take care of your sister. I will just pack up the turkey and put it in the freezer. We can always have it another time. Thank you for understanding, Dad. You are the best, Justin replied, his tone instantly shifting from panicked to subtly manipulative. Listen, I am going to make this up to you. How about I swing by your place next Tuesday evening? We can have dinner, catch up, and I can quickly help you sign those routine medical and tax paperwork I dropped off last week. Just standard administrative stuff for the end of the year. Standard administrative stuff. The conservatorship papers. The trap disguised as a chore. That sounds wonderful, son, I answered meekly. I will have the papers ready on the counter. You just focus on Nicole. I hung up the phone and let it drop onto the sofa cushion. The charade was over. The sickly sweet veneer of the lie lingered in the quiet room, but it did not comfort me. It only ignited a cold, hard flame in my chest. I pretended to accept the lie, because decades of building a massive corporate logistics empire from the ground up had taught me one invaluable lesson. You never ever let an enemy know you have intercepted their battle plan until you are fully ready to destroy them. I stood up from the sofa, my joints popping slightly, and walked into my home office. The walls were lined with framed photographs of my family, smiling faces from vacations long past. I ignored them and sat down at my heavy oak desk. I opened my eye, the bright screen illuminating the dark room. Justin and Nicole thought I was just a clueless old man who barely knew how to check his email. They constantly underestimated me, forgetting that I had managed complex international supply chains and integrated advanced tracking software into my fleet long before they even graduated college. I navigated directly to the public social media profile of my daughter-in-law, Monica. Justin's wife was notoriously vain, addicted to showcasing her lifestyle to anyone who would look. I refreshed her page. There were no broken-down SUVs on the interstate. There were no dreary hospital waiting rooms. The digital betrayal was bright high definition and glaringly obvious. Uploaded exactly 10 minutes ago was a burst of photographs and a video. The location tag was prominently displayed at the top of the screen. An exclusive ultra-luxury ski resort in Aspen, Colorado. I watched the video play. There was Justin, perfectly healthy, wearing a designer ski jacket, raising a crystal flute of expensive champagne toward the camera. Beside him stood Nicole, holding her own glass, laughing hysterically, without a trace of a migraine. Monica and Brian, my son-in-law, were cheering in the background as snow fell gently outside the massive glass windows of their private chalet. The caption below the video read, "Escaped the dreary family obligations for some much-needed altitude and luxury. Nothing but the best for us." I stared at the glowing screen, watching my children toast to their own greed, while I sat alone in a dark house with a feast they had never intended to eat. They did not even have the common sense to hide their tracks. They were so confident in my stupidity, so secure in their belief that I was a declining, irrelevant old fool, that they flaunted their lies in broad daylight. I pushed the iPad away and reached for the thick manila envelope Justin had left on my kitchen counter 3 days prior. He had slapped it down cheerfully, telling me it was just a few routine insurance updates and tax compliance forms that my accountant needed me to sign. I put on my reading glasses, turned on the brass desk lamp, and began to read the dense, convoluted legal jargon. It did not take a corporate lawyer to understand what I was looking at. The documents were a labyrinth of deception. Buried beneath pages of standard financial disclosures were highly specific medical proxy agreements, durable power of attorney transfers, and a voluntary surrender of all primary asset management. There were clauses explicitly detailing the transfer of my banking authority to Justin in the event of cognitive decline, accompanied by a blank medical evaluation form, signed by a doctor I had never met. They were laying the precise legal groundwork to declare me legally incompetent, strip me of my human rights, and seize my $8 million estate without a single day in court. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with the terrifying precision of a steel trap. The massive debts my children were secretly drowning in the sudden intense interest in my health over the last few months. The isolation they had carefully orchestrated by driving away my old friends with claims that I needed rest. It was all a meticulously designed campaign to consume me. As I sat there holding the physical proof of my own children's malice, the profound, crushing grief that had defined my life for 7 lonely years instantly evaporated. The pathetic, hopeful old father who waited by the window for a visit died in that chair. The tears I had shed over Evelyn's grave, the desperate longing for my family to remain whole, burned away in the heat of an absolute, unforgiving resolve. I stood up from the desk. My back was straight, my hands were no longer shaking, and my mind was sharper than it had been in a decade. I walked back into the formal dining room. The golden afternoon light had faded into a cold blue evening. I looked at the 12 empty chairs. I looked at the beautiful roasted turkey, the steaming bowls of potatoes, the fresh bread, and the crystal glasses. I did not feel sorry for myself anymore. I walked into the kitchen and pulled out 3 large, heavy-duty black garbage bags. I marched back into the dining room and began to methodically destroy the feast. I grabbed the edge of the silver platter and scraped the entire turkey directly into the trash. I dumped the stuffing, the expensive wines, the pies, and the side dishes, violently throwing away every ounce of love and effort I had wasted on people who wanted to put me in a cage. I scraped the fine china clean, tied the heavy garbage bags into tight knots, and dragged them out the back door, tossing them ruthlessly into the freezing night air. I washed my hands in the kitchen sink, watching the grease and gravy spiral down the drain. I walked to the front door, turned the heavy brass deadbolt, and listened to the loud, satisfying click of the lock sliding into place. The waiting was over. I was done making excuses for their cruelty. I was done playing the role of the fragile victim. My children believed they were playing a brilliant game of chess against a blind opponent. They had no idea that they had just awakened a ruthless, calculating businessman who had spent 40 years crushing corporate rivals who were 10 times smarter than they would ever be. I walked back to my study and picked up the phone to call my lawyer. It was time to show my children exactly what happens when the ghost they created decides to haunt them. Monday morning arrived with a bitter chill that seeped through the windows of my empty house. I did not brew the usual pot of coffee. I did not sit by the glass pane waiting for a phone call that would never come. That version of George Bennett died the moment I heard my own children plotting to throw me into a state ward. Instead, I put on my tailored charcoal suit, the one I used to wear to board meetings when I was building my logistics empire from the ground up. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror. The heavy grief that had aged me for 7 years was completely gone, replaced by a cold and sharpened clarity. I locked the front door of the family home and drove out of the quiet suburban bubble my children thought I was trapped in. I drove straight into the bustling heart of the city to execute a war they did not know had started. My destination was the private law firm of Wallace. Wallace and I went back 40 years. He was the man who drafted my first major corporate contracts and the man who stood silently beside me at my wife's funeral. He knew the George Bennett who ruthlessly negotiated multi-million-dollar supply chain deals, not the frail old man my children believed me to be. When I walked into his mahogany-paneled office, Wallace looked up from his heavy oak desk. He took one look at my rigid posture and the hard expression on my face and immediately closed the thick file he was working on. He knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. I did not exchange pleasantries. I sat down across from him and placed my tablet and the thick manila envelope of conservatorship papers directly on his desk. I played the audio recording of the pocket-dialed Thanksgiving phone call. I sat in total silence and let Wallace listen to Justin and Nicole laughing about liquidating my $8 million portfolio and locking me in a miserable facility. Wallace did not speak for a long time after the audio stopped. His jaw tightened visibly. He had known my children since they were toddlers playing in my backyard. "We need a comprehensive forensic audit." "Wallace," I said, my voice eerily calm and steady. "I want every single financial footprint Justin, Nicole, and my son-in-law, Brian, have left over the past 5 years. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. I want to know exactly why they are so desperate to steal my estate right this very moment." Wallace nodded slowly, processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. He picked up his desk phone and immediately called in a forensic accountant from his firm. Within the hour, we were sitting in a secure, windowless conference room, surrounded by glowing monitors and complex banking databases. I gave the forensic team lawful access to access my personal and corporate financial archives, allowing him to trace any external connections to my various accounts. The hours ticked by in heavy silence, broken only by the rapid and continuous clicking of the forensic accountant's keyboard. I sat perfectly still, drinking black coffee, feeling the last agonizing remnants of my paternal instinct wither away into dust. Finally, the forensic accountant paused, exhaled deeply, and pushed a stack of freshly printed financial reports across the polished table. The truth was far more devastating, pathetic, and dangerous than I could have ever imagined. It was not just simple greed driving my children. It was sheer, desperate, animalistic panic. We started the audit with my son. For the last 3 years, Justin had been parading around the city as a highly successful tech entrepreneur, driving imported sports cars and boasting loudly about massive venture capital funding. The forensic audit ripped that glamorous facade to shreds in seconds. His tech startup was completely bankrupt and had been for months. The venture capital funding had dried up 2 years ago due to his gross mismanagement. To maintain his lavish lifestyle and his wife Monica's endless vanity, Justin had been taking out massive high-interest loans from extremely questionable sources. He was bleeding money at a catastrophic rate. His corporate accounts were overdrawn by hundreds of thousands of dollars, and his creditors were no longer sending polite warning letters. They were preparing to file aggressive federal lawsuits that would pierce his corporate veil and seize his personal assets. My son was not a successful visionary. He was a desperate fraud, drowning in a deep sea of debt, playing a very dangerous game of financial roulette. Then we shifted the focus to Nicole and Brian. My daughter had always played the role of the perfect affluent suburban wife, supposedly married to a brilliant and wealthy investment banker. The reality uncovered by the forensic review was much darker and far more volatile. Brian was not managing high-yield investments. He was aggressively gambling them away. The forensic review uncovered a hidden trail of offshore transactions leading directly to illegal high-stakes gambling syndicates. Brian had lost millions of dollars. He had quietly liquidated their life savings, emptied their children's college funds, and remortgaged their luxury home twice over without telling anyone. They owed massive, staggering sums to ruthless people who did not resolve their financial disputes in a civil courtroom. The ultra-luxury Aspen ski trip they were currently flaunting on social media was a desperate, fabricated illusion. It was funded by maxed-out credit cards, a pathetic attempt to pretend everything was perfectly fine while their entire world burned down around them. But the final revelation, brought forward by the accountant, was the one that truly turned my blood to ice. The forensic team pulled up a series of preliminary loan applications from a highly predatory private lending firm. I looked closely at the collateral listed on the dense legal documents. It was my house, my primary residence, and a significant portion of my unencumbered blue-chip stock portfolio. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was my name, perfectly executed in blue ink, but I had never signed it. Justin and Nicole had secretly leveraged my entire estate to secure illicit loans to keep themselves out of prison and away from violent creditors. They had forged my signature on preliminary documents to buy themselves a few more weeks of time. It was a blatant, calculated, and massive federal crime. The terrifying reality of the situation hit me with a sickening clarity. My children were not just waiting for me to die naturally. They simply could not afford to wait. The forged loans were coming due very soon, and the private lenders were demanding the physical collateral. If I was alive and mentally competent, the banking institutions would easily discover the forgery, and Justin and Nicole would go straight to federal prison for a very long time. But if I was officially declared mentally unfit, if Justin successfully secured a conservatorship and became the sole legal guardian of my estate, he could silently authorize the asset transfers, cover their massive debts, and sweep their terrible crimes completely under the rug. I was not just an inconvenience to my family. I was the only living witness to their felony. My sanity and my freedom were direct threats to their survival. That is exactly why they needed me isolated from the world. That is why they wanted me locked away in a secure ward where no one would ever listen to my complaints. They were fully willing to medicate and isolate their own father to save themselves from the brutal consequences of their spectacular failures. The audit answered the most important question. My children were not waiting for an inheritance someday. They needed access to my assets now. I looked across Wallace's conference table and told him to begin the liquidation. Quietly, legally, without giving Justin or Nicole a single warning. We started with the house. The brick estate was where Evelyn and I raised our family, where I marked the children's height against a doorway, and where I spent 7 years setting tables for people who never came. It was also the asset Justin and Nicole had represented to private lenders as if they already controlled it. The house was paid off. That made it valuable to them and dangerous to me. Wallace created a privacy-protected holding company using a lawful registered structure. No fictitious directors, no false identities. The company existed, kept proper records, and was administered through his firm's corporate services team. I retained control through the structure, but the deed would no longer sit in my personal name. The transfer was documented at an independently supported value and handled through normal closing channels. That distinction mattered. I was not hiding property from my own legitimate creditors. The obligations threatening the house came from signatures I had never authorized. My goal was to make certain that a forged preliminary collateral document could not be transformed into actual ownership simply because my children later obtained control over me. Once the holding company took title, Wallace arranged the onward sale to an unrelated buyer. The closing would finish shortly after I left the city. That meant the property would not remain parked indefinitely inside an entity I controlled. It would become what Justin and Nicole least expected: somebody else's home. Signing the transfer documents hurt more than I anticipated. Evelyn had chosen the bay windows. She had planted the rose bushes. For years, I confused protecting the building with protecting our marriage. But a house is not a marriage. Brick does not remember loyalty. People do. I signed. Then we moved to the portfolio. $8 million represented 40 years of careful investing. Blue chip stocks, municipal bonds, retirement holdings, and long-term positions I had built slowly while raising 2 children. Justin and Nicole viewed that portfolio as a rescue fund for the lives they had mismanaged. I viewed it as the last major asset they could attack through a conservatorship. Wallace's financial team liquidated the holdings through ordinary brokerage procedures. The transactions were large, but they were not disguised. Taxes, reporting obligations, and transaction records would remain exactly where the law required them to remain. What changed was ownership. The net proceeds moved into a properly established, irrevocable asset protection trust, administered outside the reach of ordinary family pressure. The trust was privacy protected, not invisible to lawful authorities. It had an independent trustee, compliance obligations, and clear terms. I retained the right to receive distributions for my lifetime needs. Justin and Nicole received nothing. More important, the trust instrument named a charitable foundation for neglected and financially abused elderly people as the irrevocable remainder beneficiary. That provision was permanent from the beginning. My children could not wait for my death and inherit the corpus because the trust already had another destination. Wallace explained the structure twice. Once this is funded, you are not personally holding an $8 million brokerage account anymore. Good. You will still have lawful access for your living expenses through the trust. Good. And your children will have no beneficiary rights. Perfect. Before approving the transfers, Wallace made me repeat the purpose of each step in plain language. The exercise was deliberate. If Justin later claimed I did not understand what I had done, Wallace wanted a contemporaneous file showing the opposite. He recorded meeting notes describing the assets, the tax effects, the trust terms, and the reason I chose each transaction. I reviewed the notes, corrected one date, and signed the final memorandum. Nothing in the file mentioned revenge. It described risk management. I had discovered forged collateral documents and a planned conservatorship. I was changing ownership structures before anyone obtained authority over me. That was all. Wallace also required the trust administrator to speak with me directly without any family member present. The administrator asked where the money came from, whether anyone was pressuring me, whether I understood the trust was irrevocable, and whether I understood the charitable remainder could not later be redirected to Justin or Nicole. I answered every question. The administrator accepted the funding. That independent step, because my children were already preparing a story in which every decision I disliked must be evidence of dementia. I wanted the record to show that the most important financial decisions of my life had been made slowly, privately, and with full understanding. When Wallace finally closed the file, there was no dramatic secret left to invent. There was simply a clean paper trail. We closed the domestic investment accounts after the liquidation settled. I kept only the modest amount of ordinary spending access necessary to complete the move. Wallace arranged a controlled allowance from the trust for my future living costs. I did not need an untraceable card or a fake banking identity. Privacy was enough. The more the structure was, the harder it would be for Justin to portray my decisions as the confused actions of an incompetent man. By Friday afternoon, Wallace placed the final confirmations in front of me. The deed transfer had been completed. The onward sale was scheduled. The brokerage liquidation had settled. The trust had received the proceeds. From a personal title perspective, the two assets my children had targeted were no longer sitting in my name, waiting for them to seize. The house belonged to the holding structure, pending the final purchaser's closing. The $8 million belonged to the trust. I sat there looking at the balance sheet and felt something I had not expected. Relief. For decades, I believed wealth was protection. That week, I learned that wealth could also become a handle other people used to drag you where they wanted. By changing the structure, I removed the handle. Justin could forge my signature on another preliminary form. Nicole could bring another doctor. They could tell a judge I was old, lonely, confused, or difficult. None of those things would recreate title to a house already being sold or turn them into beneficiaries of an irrevocable trust. Wallace asked whether I wanted to stop there and confront them immediately. I said no. If the children learned the assets were gone before I finished preparing my exit, they would panic. I needed one final period of normalcy. They had to believe I was still the same father sitting in the same chair, waiting for them to bring fresh papers. I stood and shook Wallace's hand. For the first time in 7 years, I told him, I don't feel like I'm waiting for somebody else to decide what happens to me. Outside commuters moved through the cold evening toward homes and families. I returned to the house that no longer sat in my personal name. I put on an old sweater. I made coffee. And I prepared to look my children in the eye one more time, without letting them see that the inheritance they were planning to steal had already changed shape. The financial strike was complete. Now I needed them calm enough to walk straight into the empty space where my money used to be. The morning sun crawled across the hardwood floor of the living room. I sat in my usual chair, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. It was strange to sit in a house that I no longer owned. Legally, the walls around me belonged to a faceless corporation I had created just days ago. But to the outside world, I was still George Bennett, the lonely widower waiting for his children to visit. The financial strike was completely finished. Now I had to deliver the greatest acting performance of my entire life. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, I heard the sound of an expensive engine pulling into my driveway. I stood up slowly and walked to the front window. Justin stepped out of his leased sports car, wearing a sharp navy suit. Nicole followed closely behind him, holding a thick leather portfolio. They both looked tense but determined. They were coming to secure their fraudulent conservatorship, and they thought it would be effortless. I unlocked the front door and opened it before they could ring the bell. I made sure to stoop my shoulders slightly. I relaxed the muscles in my face, making my eyes look tired and unfocused. Dad, Justin said loudly, flashing a brilliant fake smile. It is so good to see you. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to push him away. He smelled like expensive cologne and desperation. Nicole hugged me next, squeezing my shoulders tightly. We brought some pastries from that bakery you like, Nicole said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. We figured we could sit down, have some coffee, and catch up. I smiled weakly and patted her arm. That is so thoughtful of you both. I have been feeling so terribly lonely lately. Please come in and sit down. I will go make us a fresh pot of coffee. I shuffled toward the kitchen, dragging my feet just a fraction more than usual. When I turned the corner out of their sight, my frail posture vanished. I stood perfectly straight and took a deep, steadying breath. I prepared the coffee tray with meticulous care, making sure to fill my own mug to the very brim. The liquid was scalding hot. I picked up the tray and let my hands develop a slight rhythmic tremor. When I returned to the living room, Justin had already cleared the center of the coffee table. The thick leather portfolio was unzipped. He had arranged a neat stack of legal documents right next to a silver pen. They were the conservatorship papers, the legal chains they planned to wrap around my life. Justin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at me with an expression of deep manufactured concern. Yes, Dad. With the end of the year approaching, my accountant suggested we update a few routine files. Since Mom passed away, we just want to make sure you are fully protected. Some of these are standard medical proxy forms and basic asset management updates. It just means that if you ever get sick or confused, Nicole and I can handle the banking and hospital bills for you. It takes all the burden off your shoulders. I squinted at the paper and rubbed my forehead, acting completely overwhelmed. I do not know, Justin. This looks very complicated. Do I really need to sign all of this today? My eyes get so tired reading small print. Nicole leaned in, placing a warm hand over mine. Dad, you do not even need to read it. We already had the lawyers look it over. We would never ask you to sign anything that was not absolutely necessary for your own safety. We love you too much to let you struggle with these things alone. Well, I muttered, picking up the silver pen with a trembling hand. If you say it is for the best, I suppose I should trust my children. You are all I have left in this world. Justin smiled broadly, his eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. Exactly, Dad. Just sign right there at the bottom, where the yellow sticky note is. I reached out with my left hand to grab my mug of coffee, pretending I needed a sip to steady my nerves. I wrapped my fingers around the ceramic handle. As I brought the scalding liquid over the coffee table, I deliberately relaxed my grip and violently jerked my wrist downward. A massive dark wave of boiling coffee exploded across the table. The dark liquid instantly soaked through the thick legal documents, turning the crisp white pages into a ruined brown mess. The ink immediately began to bleed and smear across the signature lines. Justin leaped backward off the couch, shouting in absolute horror, as the hot coffee splashed onto his expensive trousers. Nicole shrieked and frantically grabbed the soaking wet papers, trying to shake the liquid off, but it was entirely too late. The documents were completely destroyed. Oh my goodness, I cried out, shrinking back into my chair and pulling my hands up to my chest. I am so sorry. My hands, they just slipped. I am so incredibly clumsy lately. Please forgive me, Justin. Did I burn you? Dad, he stammered, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. Dad, do you have any idea what you just did? We needed these filed by Friday. We do not have time to wait. Justin, calm down, Nicole hissed through gritted teeth, trying to maintain her fake smile while glaring daggers at me. It was an accident. Right, Dad. Just an accident. I nodded rapidly, forcing my eyes to water, just a little bit. I am so terribly sorry. I just feel so weak today. I do not think I can focus on any of this right now. My head is spinning from the shock of dropping the mug. Maybe you could go print new ones and bring them back next month. After the new year begins, I will feel much more rested. Next month, Justin shouted, losing control for a fraction of a second. We cannot wait until next month. We have deadlines. I looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Deadlines. But you said these were just routine updates. Why would there be an urgent deadline for my medical proxy? Justin froze, realizing he had almost exposed his desperate panic. He took a deep, jagged breath and forced his face back into a mask of calm concern. You are right, Dad. It is not urgent. I am just stressed about work, that is all. I think we should let Dad rest, Nicole said, her voice completely devoid of its earlier warmth. We will clean this up and head out. We can bring fresh copies in a few weeks. When they finally walked to the front door, they did not hug me goodbye. Justin muttered a quick farewell and walked briskly to his car, his ruined trousers clinging to his legs. Nicole managed a tight plastic smile before turning her back on me. 3 weeks after the coffee incident, Justin called to say he and Nicole would return the next morning with fresh papers. His voice was warm again. Too warm. He reminded me to rest so I would be clear-headed for the signatures. Nicole called later and said she was bringing pastries. I played my part. I told them I was looking forward to seeing them. Then I hung up and walked into the bedroom. The acting was over. I pulled a small leather suitcase from the top shelf of the closet and packed only what I needed: a week's worth of clothes, sturdy shoes, my medications, and the faded honeymoon photograph of Evelyn I kept in the top drawer. I left the expensive suits. I left the retirement watch. I left the framed corporate awards. Those things belonged to the version of George Bennett, who believed accumulation could hold a family together. Before I left, I handled the practical pieces of disappearing. I did not destroy my driver's license, social security card, or legal identity. Vanishing from my children did not require committing fraud or making myself unable to prove who I was. I put the government identification I still needed into a secure inner pocket of the suitcase. What I destroyed were the connections Justin and Nicole knew how to use. I cut up the old credit cards after confirming the accounts were closed. I removed family sharing permissions from devices and services. I changed the number on my phone plan and moved communication with Wallace to a new secure line they did not know. The old phone contained years of messages I no longer needed. I backed up the Thanksgiving pocket dial recording and the legal communications to Wallace's encrypted file system, then factory reset the device and left it with him for secure disposal. There would be no dramatic smashed phone, no false identity, and no illegal paper trail. Only silence. Wallace had arranged lawful travel and a modest living account connected to the trust. The payments were structured for privacy, but they were not hidden from tax authorities or based on fake names. My goal was to disappear from predatory children, not from the law. Earlier that afternoon, Wallace and I completed one final checklist over the secure line. The holding company had finished the onward sale process for the house with the handover scheduled after my departure. My domestic brokerage accounts were closed. The trust administrator had confirmed receipt of the liquidated portfolio. No conservatorship petition had been granted. No power of attorney gave Justin authority over my affairs. Wallace told me to carry copies of my medical information passport and emergency contacts in the suitcase. He also reminded me that if my children filed a missing person report, I was free to tell local law enforcement privately that I was safe and did not want my location disclosed unless required by law. That mattered. I was not staging my death. I was not trying to waste police resources or make anyone believe I had been kidnapped. I was making an adult decision to end contact. For years, Justin and Nicole treated access to me as something they owned. They believed a father had to answer every call, explain every financial choice, open every door, and forgive every insult because biology created a permanent obligation. I was testing the opposite idea. Could a 75-year-old man decide who entered his life? Could I choose privacy without asking my children for permission? The answer was yes. I went through the desk drawers and removed only documents that belonged personally to me. Tax records already existed in Wallace's files. The original property documents were with the closing team. The trust paperwork was secured at the law firm. I left behind nothing that gave my children authority and took nothing that belonged to the incoming owners. Even the key was part of the plan. I locked the front door with the old key, then sealed it inside a small envelope addressed to Wallace and placed it in the secure drop box he had arranged nearby. The closing agent would handle transfer to the new owners. When Justin came the next morning, there would be no spare key hidden under a flower pot and no neighbor authorized to let him inside. Every ordinary detail had been considered. That was the advantage my children never understood. They believed dramatic people were powerful. My career taught me that the strongest operations are usually quiet collections of boring details executed correctly. I walked through the house one final time. The kitchen still carried faint marks from the coffee I spilled on the conservatorship papers. The formal dining room was clean again. The long table where I had set 12 places on Thanksgiving stood empty. For years, every room had held a version of Evelyn. I had treated the house as if leaving it would mean abandoning her. That night, I finally understood the difference between memory and captivity. Evelyn was not in the brick walls. She was in the photograph inside my suitcase, in the habits she taught me and the standards she expected me to keep when life became ugly. I could take those things with me. I did not leave a note. A note would have given Justin and Nicole something to argue with, something to hand a lawyer, something to turn into a story about a confused father running away. I gave them nothing. The house looked lived in. A newspaper rested on the coffee table. A clean glass sat beside the sink. The furniture remained where it had always been because the final property transfer and move-out arrangements were already being handled through Wallace. At midnight, the grandfather clock sounded through the hallway. I put on my coat. I picked up the suitcase. I locked the door behind me. A sedan arranged through a legitimate private transport company waited at the end of the street. The driver knew the destination on his work order and nothing about my family situation. I placed the suitcase in the trunk and climbed into the back seat. We drove toward a regional airport outside the city. I watched the neighborhood disappear through the window. There was no adrenaline, no panic, no sense that I was fleeing. I had spent weeks moving the assets, lawfully preserving evidence, and closing the channels my children intended to exploit. Leaving the house was simply the final operational step. The next morning, Justin and Nicole would arrive, believing they were about to secure authority over a confused old man. They would find an empty house. They would find no signed conservatorship. They would find no domestic portfolio. And they would discover that the property they had represented to lenders as future collateral was already beyond their control. For 7 years, I had been the person waiting. Now they would wait. They would call a number that no longer reached me. They would ask lawyers where I had gone. They would search records that contained no forwarding address. The difference was that I was not lost. I knew exactly where I was going. The flight carried me thousands of miles away from the winter city and toward the southern coast. I used my own legal identification at the airport, moved through security like every other traveler, and boarded without drawing attention. There was nothing suspicious about an elderly widower taking a trip. That simplicity was its own protection. By morning, I stepped into warm coastal air with one suitcase in my hand and Evelyn's photograph inside it. My children thought control required keeping me isolated. They were about to learn that solitude chosen freely was nothing like isolation imposed by force. I had not erased myself from the world. I had erased their access to me. That was enough. I stepped out of the small regional airport and took my first deep breath of warm coastal air. The bitter, freezing wind of the city I had left behind was entirely gone, replaced by the gentle scent of salt water and blooming jasmine. I had instructed my private driver to take me thousands of miles away to a quiet, sun-drenched town nestled tightly against the southern coastline. It was a place where nobody wore tailored suits and nobody cared about corporate logistics or multi-million-dollar stock portfolios. It was a town of fishermen, retired teachers, and local shop owners. For the first time in my 75 years, I was completely anonymous. I was no longer the wealthy target of my greedy children. I was just an older man with a single leather suitcase and a quiet desire to finally live. Using a modest living allowance, lawfully distributed through the trust Wallace had helped establish, I rented a modest little bungalow sitting right on the edge of the beach. It had a weathered wooden porch, a small functional kitchen, and large windows that let the golden morning light pour directly into the living room. It did not look like a mansion. It did not have expensive security systems or vaulted ceilings. It looked like a real home. The first night I slept in that bungalow, with the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore. I experienced a miracle. For 7 long years, I had suffered from agonizing insomnia, lying awake for hours, waiting for a phone call from my son or daughter that never came. But that night, I closed my eyes and sank into a deep, uninterrupted sleep. The suffocating weight of my toxic family expectations had been completely lifted from my chest. The first few weeks were a process of profound detoxification. I realized how much of my daily routine had revolved around the fear of being forgotten. I used to sit in my formal living room watching the snow pile up against the window panes, feeling the cold seep directly into my bones. I used to check my phone 20 times a day, hoping for a text message. I used to buy expensive gifts I thought might lure my children into visiting me, justifying their absence by telling myself how important their careers were. Here in the bright sunlight of the coast, I had no phone to check. I had no schedule to maintain, and no expectations to fulfill. I woke up when my body naturally wanted to wake up. I walked along the shoreline feeling the warm, coarse sand beneath my bare feet, and I watched the pelicans dive into the clear blue water with absolute freedom. I was living on a strict cash budget carefully managed to maintain my cover, but I felt infinitely wealthier than I ever did sitting in my empty brick estate. Every breath of salty air felt like a victory. However, a man who spends 40 years building an empire from a single delivery truck does not simply sit still for very long. My mind was sharp and I needed a purpose. During one of my morning walks, I stumbled upon a local community center situated near the town square. It was a busy, chaotic place that ran a food pantry and organized supply deliveries for low-income seniors. I stood in the doorway for a few minutes, watching their volunteers struggle to unload a delivery truck. Boxes of canned goods and fresh produce were stacked haphazardly, and the young woman managing the floor looked completely overwhelmed, holding a clipboard and looking ready to cry. I walked in, rolled up my sleeves, and gently asked if she needed an extra pair of hands. The community center coordinator happily accepted the offer. I did not tell her I had managed international shipping routes. I just told her my name was George and I liked to keep busy. Within a week, I had completely reorganized their storage room. I used my decades of logistics experience to restructure their delivery routes, optimizing the way they packed their vehicles to save them hours of driving time and significantly reduce their fuel costs. I built a simple inventory tracking system using basic notebooks and color-coded labels. The volunteers at the community center embraced me immediately. They did not know about my offshore trust. They did not know I had built a fortune. They only knew me as George, the reliable older gentleman who always showed up on time and knew how to fix any operational problem they threw at him. I began to make genuine friends. I became friends with a retired mechanic who taught me how to fish off the local pier. A local baker began bringing me fresh loaves of sourdough simply because she noticed I liked them. We would sit on the wooden benches outside the center drinking cheap coffee from styrofoam cups and talking about history books and gardening. When I spoke to these people, they looked me directly in the eyes. They listened to my stories, and they shared their own without ever checking their watches. There were no hidden agendas. There were no manipulative requests for loans or veiled threats about my mental competence. They valued my character, my work ethic, and my company. It was a stark, shocking contrast to the transactional relationship my own flesh and blood had forced upon me. I was respected not for what I could buy them, but simply for who I was. As the months passed, something beautiful happened. I finally began to heal from the crushing grief of losing my wife, Evelyn. Back in my old house, every corner was haunted by her absence. I had allowed my children to weaponize my grief, using my loneliness to make me feel small and dependent. But here, walking on the beach at sunset, I could finally talk to Evelyn in my mind without breaking down in tears. I remembered her warmth, her laughter, and her incredible strength. I knew with absolute certainty that she would be incredibly proud of me for refusing to become a victim. I felt her spirit beside me not as a heavy ghost, but as a comforting presence. The true test of my new life arrived when November rolled around. The anniversary of the day my children had accidentally pocket-dialed me and revealed their sinister plot. Thanksgiving was approaching. For 7 years, this holiday had been a monument to my misery. But this year, the friends I had made at the community center refused to let me spend it alone. They invited me to a massive potluck dinner hosted at the community center for all the volunteers and their families. I spent 2 days preparing. I marinated meats, I baked pies from scratch, and I cooked with a joy I thought I had lost forever. When I walked into the brightly lit community hall carrying my dishes, I was greeted by dozens of smiling faces. The retired mechanic pulled out a chair for me. The community center coordinator hugged me and thanked me for everything I had done for the center. I sat at a long folding table surrounded by loud, cheerful conversations, the clinking of silverware and genuine warmth. I looked around the room and realized I had finally found my family. It was not a family bound by blood or legal obligations. It was a chosen family, bound by mutual respect, shared effort, and simple human decency. I ate my dinner, and for the first time in nearly a decade, I laughed until my stomach hurt. Back in my hometown, the plan. Justin and Nicole had built around my supposed helplessness reached the morning. It was supposed to become real. I learned the details from Wallace. He had handled the final property transfer and remained the contact for the family that purchased the house from the holding company. After the confrontation, the new homeowner called him confused and angry, and Wallace wrote down exactly what happened. At 10 that morning, Justin's leased sports car pulled into the driveway. Nicole sat beside him with a leather portfolio containing fresh copies of the conservatorship papers. A second car followed, carrying the medical evaluator they intended to use to support their claim that I could no longer manage my own affairs. They expected a quiet house and an old man waiting to surrender. Instead, a moving truck stood in the driveway. Workers were carrying furniture through the front door, while the new homeowners directed boxes toward the garage and upstairs bedrooms. The property no longer looked like my family estate. It looked like what it legally was somebody else's home. Justin marched toward the nearest worker and demanded an explanation. The worker told him to speak to the owner. A middle-aged homeowner stepped onto the porch holding a folder from the closing company. Justin immediately announced that his father lived there, that the property was part of a pending conservatorship, and that nobody had authority to remove anything. The homeowner calmly told him the sale had closed and the former resident had already vacated. Nicole insisted that I was mentally impaired and could not possibly have sold the property lawfully. The evaluator stood behind them, suddenly much less confident than when the plan involved only a cooperative old man and a stack of medical forms. Justin demanded proof. The homeowner opened the folder and showed him the recorded deed, the closing statement, and the chain of title establishing that the property had been transferred through the holding company and then sold to the new family. Justin read the documents twice. Nicole leaned over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The house was gone, not mortgaged, not temporarily transferred. Gone. The primary asset they had represented to private lenders as collateral no longer belonged to me and could not be delivered through a conservatorship. Nicole asked the question first. If the house is gone, where is the portfolio? Justin pulled out his phone and called my old number. The call failed. He tried again. Nothing. The number had been disconnected because I had changed it before leaving exactly as planned. His next instinct was to call the brokerage firm that had held most of my domestic portfolio. The firm refused to discuss private account details with him because he had no valid authority. What it did do after he tried to submit the unsigned medical paperwork was tell him that no transaction could be initiated on my behalf without verified legal authorization. That was enough. Justin already knew what he needed to know. He had been monitoring the account structure for months. When he tried the online Family View access, he once used to see summary balances. The profile no longer existed. The domestic portfolio had been liquidated. The money was somewhere he could not reach. According to Wallace, Justin's composure disappeared almost instantly. He dropped the leather portfolio onto the frosted grass and began calling every number he had connected to my finances. The private bank, the old brokerage contact, the insurance office. Every conversation ended at the same wall. He was not my guardian. He did not hold a valid power of attorney, and nobody would release confidential information to him. Nicole moved from anger to panic. She reminded Justin that the private loans they had taken out were backed by representations about my house and investment portfolio. Those representations were now demonstrably false. If the lenders examined the actual title record, they would see the property was no longer available. If they examined the signatures, they would discover I had never authorized the preliminary collateral documents. Their entire rescue plan depended on obtaining control over me before anyone checked. They had arrived one day too late. The evaluator tried to distance himself from the dispute. He said his role was limited to assessing capacity and that he had no authority over property. Justin snapped at him, demanding that he certify me incompetent immediately. There was an obvious problem. I was not there to examine. No legitimate capacity determination could be completed by pointing at an empty house and repeating a diagnosis prepared in advance. The evaluator refused to sign anything on the driveway and left. That abandonment made the scene worse. Justin and Nicole were left alone in front of the house, surrounded by strangers, carrying out the last visible remnants of the life they expected to inherit. The new homeowner asked them to leave the property. Justin protested that family belongings were inside. The homeowner referred him back to Wallace and the closing documents. Anything I had intentionally left behind had been handled under the sale and move-out agreement. Justin had no ownership interest in the house and no right to enter it. For the first time, my children were physically standing outside a door they could not force open. The irony would have been obvious to anyone except them. Their plan had been to put me behind a locked door and take control of everything outside it. Instead, they stood on the sidewalk while another family carried boxes into the house they thought would save them. Nicole began crying. Not because I was missing. Not because she believed I might be hurt. She cried because the collateral was gone. Justin called Monica. Nicole called Brian. The conversations became frantic. Wallace did not know every word, but the new homeowner heard enough to understand that the siblings were arguing about debt-forged paperwork and money that had disappeared. Wallace later sent me scanned copies of the closing record the homeowner had shown them. I already knew every page, but seeing the timestamps reinforced how narrow their failure had been. The onward sale from the holding company had closed before Justin and Nicole arrived. The deed had been recorded. The purchase funds had cleared through escrow. There was no loose promise they could pressure someone into reversing with a phone call. Justin still tried. He called Wallace from the driveway and demanded that the transaction be unwound because I lacked capacity. Wallace asked whether he had a court order declaring me incompetent. Justin had none. He asked whether Justin possessed a valid signed power of attorney authorizing him to challenge the sale. Again, he had none. Then Wallace reminded him that the papers he and Nicole kept calling a conservatorship were only proposed documents. A conservatorship did not exist simply because children wanted one. A court had never stripped me of control over my life. That distinction destroyed the last legal bluff they had brought to the property. Nicole took the phone and accused Wallace of helping a vulnerable senior disappear. Wallace refused to discuss my location. He told her that if she genuinely believed I was missing or endangered, she was free to make a lawful welfare report. If, however, she wanted access to my financial information, she would need actual legal authority. She hung up on him. According to Wallace, that was the moment the siblings stopped pretending the visit was about my health. The new homeowner heard Justin ask Nicole how many days remained before the first private lender demanded updated collateral verification. Nicole answered that Brian's creditors were already asking questions. Their voices were low, but their fear was no longer hidden. They had come carrying medical paperwork. They left talking only about debt. Within an hour, both children left. They did not call the police because there was no theft to report. They did not file an emergency conservatorship petition that morning because the subject of the petition could not be found, and the property they wanted to control was no longer mine. They drove away with the same legal papers they brought in. The papers were suddenly useless. When Wallace finished telling me what happened, I was sitting on the porch of my coastal bungalow, with the ocean moving quietly beyond the railing. I did not celebrate. I simply understood that the first irreversible consequence had arrived. For 7 years, Justin and Nicole treated my presence as something they could postpone, ignore, and use when convenient. Now they needed me urgently, and for the first time in their lives, I was unavailable. Wallace did not need a private investigator to tell me when the financial collapse began. The consequences appeared in public filings, creditor notices, foreclosure records, and messages that Justin and Nicole's own lawyers sent while trying to understand what had happened to the collateral. The first problem was simple. The private lenders wanted updated proof that the assets supporting the loans still existed. They did not. The house had been sold. The investment portfolio was no longer in my personal name, and the signatures on the preliminary collateral documents could not be verified because I had never signed them. Once the lenders began comparing the paperwork, the grace period disappeared. Justin's startup was already weak. Without new credit, vendors stopped extending terms, and existing creditors accelerated collection. The company accounts were restricted as disputes over fraud and default multiplied. His leased luxury vehicles were repossessed after payments failed. For a man who built his identity around being seen as successful, the collapse was painfully public. One afternoon, he tried to pay for an expensive lunch with potential investors and discovered that the card tied to his business account no longer worked. Another card failed, then another. Someone else at the table paid the bill. The next morning, tow trucks collected the leased cars from his driveway. The same neighbors who once watched expensive vehicles arrive now watched them leave. Nicole's household fell just as quickly. Brian's gambling debts had already consumed their savings and pushed them into repeated refinancing. Once the expected rescue from my estate disappeared, they could not meet the obligations they had been postponing. Their mortgage fell behind. Collection notices multiplied. Brian's employer learned about the financial scandal surrounding him and terminated his position after internal review. The lifestyle Nicole displayed online became impossible to maintain. Then the marriages began to crack. Monica had enjoyed Justin's image of wealth. When the company accounts froze, the cars disappeared, and creditors began appearing in court records, she stopped pretending loyalty would survive the loss of status. She filed for divorce and moved out. Brian reacted differently. He blamed Nicole for failing to secure the conservatorship quickly enough. Nicole blamed him for the gambling losses that created the panic in the first place. Their arguments became constant. Eventually, Brian left the state, trying to separate himself from both the debts and the growing fraud investigation. That left Justin and Nicole with nobody to blame except each other. For years, their shared resentment toward me had kept them aligned. Now every failure became ammunition. Justin accused Nicole of rushing the medical plan. Nicole accused Justin of forging the signatures. He blamed Brian's gambling. She blamed Monica's spending and Justin's bankrupt startup. The alliance that had been strong enough to plan my confinement could not survive actual consequences. Their finances kept deteriorating. Justin lost access to his suburban home and moved through short-term rentals while trying to keep the startup alive long enough to sell something of value. Nicole downsized into a small rented room after foreclosure proceedings consumed the home she had once treated as proof of success. Neither had the credit necessary to restore the old lifestyle. Neither had the cash to pay off the disputed loans. Former friends stopped answering calls. The social circles they had valued did what transactional circles often do when the transactions stop. They vanished. The loan problem also created a legal contradiction Justin could not solve. To persuade the private lenders to wait, he had to maintain the story that I had authorized the collateral. But the property records now showed the house had been transferred before he obtained any valid authority over me. If he claimed I was competent when I signed the supposed collateral documents, the forged signature became the central issue. If he claimed I had been incompetent all along, the lenders could ask why they should rely on paperwork supposedly signed by a man he now described as unable to understand his own affairs. Every version damaged him. Nicole faced the same problem. She had helped present my estate as the solution to Brian's debts, but she possessed them. She had helped present my estate as the solution to Brian's debts, but she possessed no recorded ownership interest, no valid power of attorney, and no court order giving her authority. Once the lenders demanded formal proof, family expectation stopped meaning anything. That was the quiet beauty of documentation. For years, my children treated future inheritance as if it were present property. The law did not. An adult child's expectation is not a deed. A conversation about what a parent might leave someday is not collateral. A forged signature does not become real because the forger is under pressure. Wallace told me several creditors had begun preserving the suspicious documents rather than simply destroying them. That increased the risk of a formal fraud investigation. Justin and Nicole knew it. Their communications became more frantic as they tried to persuade lenders that the missing assets were only temporarily unavailable. They even attempted to revive the dementia story. One letter from a lawyer representing Justin claimed that I had made unusual transfers during a period of possible cognitive instability. Wallace answered with a short response. There was no conservatorship order, no adjudication of incapacity, and the property transfers had been completed through counsel. The letter disappeared after that. The same pattern repeated with Nicole. She tried to portray my disappearance as a family emergency rather than a deliberate withdrawal. But every time someone asked for proof that she had legal authority over me, she had nothing to provide. Their strongest weapon had always been the assumption that I would cooperate. Once I stopped cooperating, the structure had no foundation. The children who once ignored my phone calls began making dozens of calls to Wallace's office. He answered only when professional obligations required it. They asked whether I was alive. Then they asked where the trust was. The order of those questions told him everything. Wallace sent me only the information that could be documented lawfully. He did not send hidden recordings from bedrooms or illegal account screenshots. I saw foreclosure filings, corporate notices, public civil cases, and correspondence from lawyers trying to determine whether my assets could still be reached. That was enough. The pattern was obvious. Without my estate as the final source of collateral, every weak structure in their lives collapsed at once. I read the reports on my coastal porch with the ocean moving beyond the railing. I did not feel joy. I felt distance. My children were living with the financial problems they had tried to solve by taking control of me. That was not revenge. It was the absence of rescue. The distinction mattered. I had not called their employers. I had not sabotaged their credit cards. I had not sent anyone to threaten them. I had simply removed my property and my money from a scheme I never authorized. Everything after that came from their own debts. By the time the first winter after my disappearance began to ease, Justin and Nicole were no longer asking how to recover their old lives. They were asking one question. Where was George Bennett? If they could find me, they still believed they could reopen the vault. That belief pushed them into the next mistake. By the time the first months of my disappearance had passed, Justin and Nicole were no longer trying to preserve dignity. Their cars were gone, their marriages were fracturing, and the lenders who accepted forged collateral were demanding answers they could not provide. Instead of accepting what they had done, my children built one final fantasy. They decided I had not outsmarted them. I had simply become confused. According to the updates Wallace received through their lawyers and the inquiries reaching his office, Justin and Nicole began telling anyone who would listen that I was suffering from rapid cognitive decline. They claimed unknown people had manipulated me into selling the house and moving the portfolio. In their version of events, they were not desperate debtors searching for money. They were devoted children trying to rescue a vulnerable father. That lie became the foundation of their search. They sold the last luxury items they could convert into cash and hired an expensive private investigative firm. The investigators specialized in locating missing adults, hidden debtors, and people who had deliberately reduced their public footprint. Justin and Nicole promised a large success fee if the firm found me. The search began with lawful records. The investigators reviewed the property chain and found the sale from me to the privacy-protected holding company, followed by the completed sale to the new homeowners. They searched corporate registries for the entity behind the first transaction. The company was real, properly registered and represented by Wallace's firm, but its lawful privacy structure did not reveal my current location. They examined publicly available litigation title records and business filings. Nothing pointed to the coast. They then tried to reconstruct my financial movements. The domestic brokerage accounts showed a completed liquidation before they were closed, but private investigators had no authority to compel an offshore trustee to disclose confidential beneficiary information. Wallace had already instructed every institution involved to comply with lawful court process and nothing else. There was no secret bribe, no stolen bank file, no magical database. There was simply no legal path from the public record to my front porch. The investigators moved to transportation. They searched commercial databases for hotel reservations, vehicle registrations, property purchases, and public utility records under my name. They found almost nothing because I had deliberately chosen a modest life. I had not bought a house. I had not purchased a car. My bungalow arrangement was handled through a lawful rental structure set up with Wallace's assistance, and I paid ordinary living expenses from a controlled allowance. I had not destroyed my legal identity. I still possessed my identification, filed what I was required to file, and used my real name when the law required it. I had simply stopped broadcasting my life. That difference defeated much of the search. Justin and Nicole expected a 75-year-old man to leave a trail of panic emergency room visits, repeated credit card charges, confused hotel stays, police contacts, or frantic calls to old friends. I left none of those things because I was not lost. I was living. The investigators checked hospitals and public missing person databases. They found no record because I had never been reported missing through a credible process and had never required emergency help. They contacted former business associates. Most had not heard from me in years. Wallace declined to disclose privileged or confidential information. The most revealing part of the search was how little the investigators actually knew about the crime that started it. Justin and Nicole could not hand them a legitimate conservatorship order because none existed. They could not produce a valid mortgage on my property because I had never granted one. They could not produce an executed power of attorney giving either child authority over my accounts. Every time the investigators asked for formal proof of the rights the siblings claimed to possess, the file became thinner, so the story kept changing. First, I was a confused father who had wandered away. Then I was a paranoid retiree manipulated by strangers. Then I was supposedly hiding because I had committed tax fraud. Wallace documented each version as it reached him. The contradictions made it harder for the investigators to treat my children as reliable clients. One investigator finally told Justin that if he truly believed I had been exploited, the proper route was to report the alleged crime and cooperate fully with authorities. Justin refused. A real investigation into my disappearance would also examine the forged collateral that caused the crisis in the first place. That refusal said more than any confession could have. Weeks became months. The investigators' invoices kept arriving. Justin and Nicole kept paying. They pawned jewelry, watches, and anything else that still carried resale value. Every dollar they spent searching for me made their own position weaker. Eventually, the lead investigator delivered the conclusion they did not want to hear. My disappearance was deliberate. There was no evidence that I had wandered away in confusion. The asset movements had been coordinated before I left. The property sale was completed through lawyers. The domestic accounts had been closed in an orderly sequence. My old phone number had been terminated. The absence of a public trail was not proof of dementia. It was proof of planning. The firm offered to continue only if Justin and Nicole paid another large retainer for broader inquiries. They could not. Their credit was destroyed. Their remaining valuables were gone. The investigators closed the file. Wallace told me about that development during one of our scheduled secure calls. I was sitting on my porch with a glass of iced tea while the evening light turned the ocean silver. I asked one question. Did they ever ask the investigators to tell me they missed me? Wallace was quiet for a moment. No. Of course they had not. They asked where the money went. They asked whether I could be compelled to return. They asked whether the trust could be challenged. They asked whether I had signed anything while supposedly incompetent. Even after a year of losing everything, they were still searching for an asset before they were searching for a father. The private hunt ended there. The legal one did not. The lenders whose applications carried my forged signature had begun comparing documents. The inconsistencies were no longer isolated. Financial institutions and investigators were following the same paper trail Wallace and I had discovered before I vanished. Justin and Nicole had spent their last money trying to find me before that trail reached them. They failed. By the time the investigators walked away, my children had no meaningful assets left, no spouses willing to stand beside them, and no private search firm willing to work without payment. They were not trapped because I had hidden behind a fake identity or bribed anyone to erase records. They were trapped because every lawful record pointed back to what they had done, and the next people looking for them would not be private investigators. Exactly 365 days had passed since I walked out of the heavy front doors of my brick estate and erased my footprint from the world. The warm southern sun beat down on my shoulders as I knelt in the soft, damp soil of my backyard garden. I was planting a row of heirloom tomatoes, listening to the distant rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the shoreline. My hands, which used to sign massive corporate logistics contracts, were now covered in rich, dark earth. I felt a profound, undeniable sense of peace. The agonizing phantom pains of waiting by the window for my children to call had completely vanished. I was a ghost, and my afterlife was exceptionally quiet and beautiful. I wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of my forearm and stood up to stretch my aching knees. The coastal breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and salt water. I looked out over the low wooden fence, watching the local fishermen haul in their daily catch. It was a perfectly normal, perfectly serene afternoon. Then the sharp, shrill ringing of my encrypted mobile phone shattered the silence. I froze in place. I only gave this secure number to one person on the entire planet. I walked over to the wooden porch, washed my hands quickly under the outdoor hose, dried them on my denim jeans, and picked up the device. It was my lawyer, Wallace. He never called my secure line unless it was a matter of absolute necessity. I answered the call, and Wallace's deep, gravelly voice echoed through the speaker. He did not waste any time with pleasantries or asking about the weather. He knew me too well for that. He told me the manhunt was officially over. The expensive, ruthless corporate investigators that Justin and Nicole had drained their final pennies to hire had completely given up the chase. They had run headfirst into the impenetrable legal walls of the anonymous shell company we built. They had tried to trace the offshore transfers and hit an absolute dead end. Recognizing that they were hunting a ghost who had orchestrated a flawless disappearance, the intelligence firm had bled my children's bank accounts dry and simply walked away. Justin and Nicole were entirely out of resources. Their desperate, expensive gamble to track me down had failed spectacularly. But that was not the primary reason Wallace was calling me today. The private hunt orchestrated by my children was over, but the federal hunt had just concluded. Wallace explained that the banking institutions had finally connected all the dots on the forged collateral documents. The massive high-interest loans Justin and Nicole had secured using my unencumbered real estate and my stock portfolio as fake collateral had triggered automated federal red flags when the payments completely stopped. The banks realized the signatures on the property deeds were entirely fabricated. The federal prosecutors had quietly and methodically built an airtight case against my children for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit severe financial crimes. Then Wallace dropped the final and most pathetic piece of the puzzle. He told me that less than an hour ago he had received an urgent, frantic email sent directly to his private law firm address. It was from Justin. My son had bypassed all standard legal channels and sent a message dripping with pure, unadulterated desperation. Wallace read the email aloud to me over the secure connection, and I listened to the pathetic, crumbling arrogance of the boy I had raised. Justin wrote that he knew Wallace had to be in contact with me. He claimed that the family was in a state of absolute devastating crisis and that they needed to speak with their father immediately. The email was a masterclass in disgusting emotional manipulation. Justin wrote that he and Nicole were terrified for my health, believing I had suffered a severe mental breakdown and wandered off in a state of paranoid dementia. He begged Wallace to facilitate a mediated in-person meeting, claiming it was an absolute matter of life and death. He promised that if I just sat down with them in a safe, controlled environment, they could explain everything and bring our family back together. I stood on my wooden porch, looking out at the calm blue ocean, listening to the desperate lies pouring out of my son's email. They still thought I was a fool. Even with their lives burning to the ground around them, even with federal indictments hanging over their heads, they genuinely believed they could still manipulate me. They thought that if they could just get me in a room, they could turn on the fake tears, play the role of the devoted, terrified children, and convince me to sign over the offshore trust to bail them out of federal prison. They believed a few hollow apologies could erase 7 years of neglect and a calculated plot to chemically lobotomize me. George Wallace said, his voice quiet and cautious over the line. I can ignore the email. I can tell him I have no idea where you are and let the federal agents handle them by the end of the week. You never have to look at their faces again. You have built a beautiful life down there. You do not owe them a single second of your time. I took a long, slow breath of the salty ocean air. I thought about the untouched Thanksgiving turkeys I had thrown in the garbage. I thought about the heavy steel deadbolt they had installed on the outside of my home office door. I thought about the sheer breathtaking malice it took to forge medical documents to lock their own father in a state-run cage. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the cold, calculating businessman inside me awaken one last time. No, Wallace, I replied, my voice as hard and unforgiving as solid ice. Do not ignore the email. I want you to reply to him right now. Tell him I have agreed to a meeting. Wallace paused, clearly surprised by my decision. Are you absolutely sure about this, George? They are incredibly desperate. Desperate people are unpredictable and highly toxic. You have already won the war. There is no need to step back onto the battlefield. I have won the financial war. Wallace, I agreed, keeping my voice perfectly steady. But they still think they are dealing with a confused, senile old man. They still believe they are the smartest people in the room. I want to look them directly in the eyes when they finally realize exactly who dismantled their lives. I want to watch the realization hit them that the father they mocked and discarded is the architect of their absolute destruction. I gave Wallace precise instructions. I told him to arrange the meeting for this coming Friday in the most sterile, windowless conference room at his downtown law firm. I told him to set the terms strictly. No spouses, no outside lawyers, and absolutely no electronic devices allowed in the room. They were to arrive exactly at noon, and they would wait for me to enter. I will book a private charter flight tonight, I told my old friend. Have a secure car waiting for me at the private airstrip. It is time to put this ghost story to rest permanently. The private charter landed before noon on Friday, and the cold city air hit me the moment I stepped onto the tarmac. I had not returned to reclaim the old house or to search for the life I abandoned. I came back for one controlled conversation. Wallace's car took me directly to his downtown firm. He met me in a private office instead of the lobby and handed me a thin folder containing the messages Justin and Nicole had sent after I agreed to the meeting. Their desperation was obvious even on paper. Justin insisted that the meeting had to happen in person because my condition made telephone communication unreliable. Nicole wrote that I had probably transferred the money while confused and that the family only wanted to bring Dad home safely. Then came the real purpose. Attached to one message was a draft authorization giving Justin broad authority to contact the offshore trustee and request distributions from the $8 million trust. They had not changed at all. They were still building the same lie. George Bennett was mentally impaired. His children were rescuing him, and the money had to be placed in their hands for everyone's protection. Wallace asked if I still wanted to proceed. Yes, I gave him the terms again. No Monica. No Brian. No outside lawyers. No phones, tablets, recording devices, or last-minute paperwork carried into the room without Wallace seeing it first. The meeting would take place in the most neutral conference room in the firm. No food. No coffee. No family photographs. Nothing that allowed them to turn the encounter into a sentimental reunion. Wallace had already communicated those terms. Justin objected first. He claimed I needed Monica present because she had helped manage the family finances. Wallace refused. Nicole demanded that Brian be allowed to attend because he supposedly understood the lending problems better than she did. Wallace refused again. Then they accepted. They had no bargaining power left. I changed in Wallace's private washroom. I put on the charcoal suit I used to wear when I still ran major logistics negotiations. The jacket fit more loosely than it had years earlier, but the man in the mirror looked healthier than the one who had left the city. The coastal year had put color back into my face. My posture was straight. My hands were steady. I did not want Justin and Nicole to see me immediately. The entire meeting depended on allowing them a few minutes to believe their old strategy might still work. At 11:45, Wallace received word from reception that they had arrived. They were early. He left me in the adjoining office and went to meet them. Through the closed door, I could not hear their conversation, but I did not need to. Wallace returned 10 minutes later and described exactly what happened. Justin had arrived carrying the same kind of leather portfolio he used during the conservatorship attempt. Nicole carried a small packet of tissues and had asked twice whether I had been properly evaluated since disappearing. Both of them wanted confirmation that I was still confused. Wallace gave them none. He simply escorted them to the conference room and reminded them that the meeting would end immediately if they threatened me, touched me without permission, or tried to remove any document from the room. Their response told him everything. Justin asked whether I had access to the offshore trust. Nicole asked whether I still remembered the account passwords. Neither of them asked whether I was happy. Neither asked whether I had been safe for the last year. Neither asked where I had lived or whether I had been sick. Money came first. Wallace returned to the adjoining office and closed the door. They brought one document, he said. He placed a copy in front of me. It was the authorization I had already seen in their email. The language was dressed up as a routine family assistance form, but the operative provisions would let Justin contact the trustee, request distributions, and direct funds back toward domestic accounts. They believed one signature could reopen the vault they had lost. I looked at the paper and remembered the first packet they brought to my house. Routine medical forms, routine tax forms, routine assistance. The wording had changed. The purpose had not. Wallace asked what I wanted to do if they started crying. Let them. If they claim you ran away because of dementia, let them finish. If they put the authorization in front of you, I want it on the table. Wallace understood. The trap this time was not financial. I was not setting up another transfer or another disappearing asset. I wanted them to say exactly why they came. I wanted every lie exhausted before I answered. At noon, Wallace returned to the conference room and told them I had arrived. He did not bring me in immediately. He allowed them to wait. For 7 years I had waited for them. They could survive 10 minutes. I stood alone in the quiet adjoining office and thought about Evelyn. I thought about the first Thanksgiving after she died, when I kept checking the driveway, because I was certain our children would understand how hard the day was for me. I thought about the second year, when I told myself they were busy. The third, when I blamed work. The fourth, when I blamed distance. By the seventh, they were no longer simply absent. They were using my loneliness as part of a plan. That history did not make me weak anymore. It made the next step simple. Wallace returned and told me Justin and Nicole were seated across from each other at the far side of the glass table. They had spent the waiting period whispering over the authorization form and rehearsing who would speak first. Justin would play the exhausted son. Nicole would play the frightened daughter. They still expected the old George Bennett to enter. The one who apologized when they failed to call. The one who accepted every excuse. The one who would sign anything if they promised to visit next week. I buttoned my jacket. Wallace moved toward the conference room, but I stopped him. "I go in first." He nodded. I walked down the quiet hallway until I reached the heavy oak doors. On the other side sat the two people who had searched the country, not because they missed me, but because they needed my money before the law caught them. They had prepared their final bait. Now they were waiting to see whether the ghost would bite. I stood outside the heavy oak doors of the conference room. For a brief moment, I closed my eye and allowed the memory of the last 7 years to wash over me. I remembered the agonizing silence of my empty house. I remembered the cold Thanksgiving dinners. I remembered the pathetic, fragile old man who used to stare at the telephone, begging the universe for a single text message from his son or daughter. That man was completely gone. In his place stood the architect of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit. I adjusted my silk tie. I stood perfectly straight, feeling the robust health and absolute clarity the coastal sun had baked into my bones. I was 75 years old, but I felt like a titan. I reached out, placed my hands flat against the polished wood, and pushed the heavy doors wide open. The atmosphere inside the windowless conference room shifted the instant I crossed the threshold. Justin and Nicole were sitting hunched over the massive glass table looking like terrified hostages. When they heard the heavy doors open, their heads snapped up simultaneously. I watched the rehearsed expressions of tragic relief completely freeze on their faces. The shock in their hollow eyes was absolute. They had expected Wallace to wheel in a broken, confused geriatric patient, wearing a stained sweater and a lost expression. They expected a man they could easily overwhelm with loud voices and fake tears. Instead, they were looking at a ghost who had resurrected himself into a predator. I walked into the room with slow, deliberate, and powerful steps. My shoes clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. I did not smile. I did not speak. I simply let them absorb the visual impact of my absolute physical and mental command. Justin had lost so much weight, his wrinkled suit hung off his shoulders like a discarded tarp. His hands were trembling violently against the glass table. Nicole looked even worse. Her previously immaculate hair was frizzy and unwashed, and the deep stress lines around her mouth made her look 20 years older. The luxurious, arrogant children who had laughed about locking me in a state-run medical ward were completely gone. They were replaced by desperate hunted animals. The sheer panic of their reality finally overrode their initial shock. They remembered the script they had rehearsed. They remembered that federal agents were closing in, and I was their only remaining lifeline. Nicole let out a piercing theatrical sob that echoed sharply off the sterile walls. "Dad. Oh my God. Dad." She wailed, scrambling out of her chair. Her voice was painfully shrill, dripping with manufactured hysteria. "We were so terrified. We finally found you." Justin leaped up right behind her, violently kicking his chair back. He contorted his gaunt face into the mask of pure tragic desperation. "Dad, we have been searching everywhere," he choked out, forcing his eyes to water. They lunged forward, rushing around the edge of the large glass table, with their arms stretched wide open, preparing to wrap me in a suffocating embrace of fake devotion. They wanted to smother me with physical affection, to establish immediate psychological dominance. They wanted to drag me back into the pathetic role of the dependent father. I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch. As they closed the distance, I simply raised my right hand, holding it up flat and rigid like a concrete wall between us. I locked my eyes directly onto Justin's face and delivered a stare so cold and devoid of any paternal warmth that it hit him like a physical blow. "Stop exactly where you are," I commanded. My voice was deep, resonant, and echoed with absolute, unquestionable authority. "Do not take another step toward me." The command cracked through the air like a whip. Justin and Nicole stopped dead in their tracks, their arms still hovering awkwardly in the empty space between us. They looked as if they had just slammed face first into an invisible pane of glass. The fake tears completely stalled in Nicole's eyes. Justin's jaw dropped open, letting out a small, pathetic gasp of confusion. They were completely paralyzed. The fragile, confused old man they had planned to manipulate had just barked an order that commanded total submission. "Sit down," I instructed, pointing my finger toward the two empty chairs on the far side of the table. They did not argue. The sheer dominating force of my presence completely short-circuited their rehearsed manipulation. They slowly backed away, retreating to their side of the glass table like scolded children. They sank back into their chairs, their eyes wide and darting frantically between me and my lawyer. I walked past them, pulling out the heavy leather chair located at the absolute head of the table right next to Wallace. I sat down, deliberately buttoned my suit jacket, and rested my hands flat against the cool glass surface. Wallace sat silently beside me, radiating professional detachment. He did not offer them a greeting or a glass of water. He simply opened a thick black leather folder and waited. Justin finally gathered the miserable remnants of his courage. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass table, trying to adopt a soft, patronizing tone. He was struggling to play the role of the concerned, responsible son managing a difficult situation. "Dad, we do not understand why you are acting this way," he whispered, shaking his head with a look of deep manufactured sorrow. "We have been absolutely sick with worry. We spent every last dime we had hiring private investigators to track you down. When you just vanished from the house without a word, we thought the absolute worst had happened. The doctors told us your mind was slipping. They warned us you might become paranoid and wander off. We forgive you for running away, Dad. We know you did not mean to cause all this horrible trouble. We just want to bring you home and get you the medical help you desperately need." I sat perfectly still, listening to the sickening fairy tale pouring out of their mouths. It was an astonishing display of sociopathic arrogance. They were currently facing decades in a federal penitentiary for forging my signature on illicit loans. They had actively conspired with corrupt doctors to steal my human rights. Yet they sat directly to my face in a highly secure law office, trying to convince me that I was a sick, paranoid patient who needed their merciful rescue. They were clinging to their lies because it was the only raft they had left in a rapidly sinking ocean. The silence in the room stretched out for what felt like an eternity. I let them sit there in their carefully constructed web of lies, waiting for me to respond to their pathetic performance. I looked at Justin and then at Nicole. I did not blink. I slowly reached down to the heavy leather briefcase resting by my feet. I unclasped the brass buckles with a loud, definitive snap that echoed sharply in the sterile, windowless room. I did not pull out a pen. I did not pull out the signature authorization form they were desperately hoping for. Instead, I pulled out a small black digital audio recorder and placed it exactly in the center of the massive glass table. I pressed the play button. The sterile conference room was suddenly filled with the loud, echoing acoustics of a crowded high-end ski lodge. Then came the undeniable sound of Nicole's voice dripping with cruel annoyance. "Just let the old man eat alone again," she said through the small speaker. "I am not spending my holiday listening to him talk about Mom or his glory days. It is depressing." I watched the blood completely drain from Nicole's face. Her jaw dropped open in silent horror. She tried to reach out across the table to stop the device, but she was entirely paralyzed by shock. The recording continued playing flawlessly. Justin's voice cut through the background noise, casual and calculating. "Look, we need him isolated anyway," the digital recording of my son stated. "Once I get those conservatorship papers pushed through next month, we can finally dump him in that state-run facility upstate. We get him declared mentally unfit. I take over as legal guardian. Then we immediately liquidate the house and his entire $8 million stock portfolio. The old man will not even know what hit him until they lock the door to his ward." I reached out and calmly pressed the stop button. The silence that rushed back into the room was absolute and suffocating. Justin looked as if the air had been violently knocked out of his lungs. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The carefully constructed mask of the devoted, terrified son shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before my eyes. They realized in a single terrifying heartbeat that I had heard every single word of their sinister plot on the exact day they planned it, before either of them could formulate a pathetic excuse. I reached back into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick stack of glossy high-definition photographs. I tossed them across the smooth glass surface, spreading them out like a deck of playing cards. They were the pictures Monica had posted on social media. There was Justin raising a crystal flute of champagne in a designer ski jacket. There was Nicole laughing hysterically in the snow. I pointed to the timestamp clearly printed at the bottom of the photos. "Aspen, Colorado," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. "A remarkable recovery considering your transmission exploded on the interstate, and Nicole was suffering a severe medical emergency in a hospital waiting room." Justin stared at the glossy photos, his hands trembling so violently they rattled against the glass table. "Dad." He stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Dad, please, you do not understand. We were just stressed out from work. We were making a stupid, terrible joke on the phone. We never actually meant any of those things. It was just a horrible misunderstanding. We love you, Dad." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I pulled the final and most devastating piece of evidence from my briefcase. It was a massive bound folder containing the complete forensic financial audit Wallace and his team had painstakingly compiled a year ago. I dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud that made both of my children jump in their seats. "There is no misunderstanding, Justin," I replied coldly. "I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what you have done. I know your tech startup has been completely bankrupt for 2 years. I know Brian's offshore gambling debts have drained your sister dry. I know about the violent shadow syndicates hunting you down." Nicole let out a stifled, sobbing gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The reality that their deepest, darkest secrets were sitting right in front of them completely destroyed her fragile composure. She began to weep, real tears of absolute terror. But the final nail in the coffin was yet to come. I opened the heavy folder and pulled out the forged preliminary loan documents. I slid them across the table directly in front of Justin. "I know that you secretly leveraged my completely unencumbered home and my entire retirement portfolio to secure illicit high-interest loans," I stated, locking my eyes onto his terrified face. "I know you forged my signature on these loan and collateral documents. You were drowning in massive debt, and you needed collateral to save yourselves from prison and from the violent people you owed money to. But you knew the banks would verify those signatures if I was walking around with a sound mind. You needed me officially declared mentally incompetent, so you could bypass the security checks and quietly authorize the transfer of my life savings." The absolute truth hung in the sterile air of the conference room, crushing them under its weight. I watched the last remaining shreds of their arrogant delusion evaporate into nothingness. They finally understood the timeline. They realized that the spilled coffee on the conservatorship papers, the sudden disappearance, the sale of the house and the vanishing of the $8 million were not the chaotic actions of a man descending into paranoia. They were the calculated, precise maneuvers of a man who was 10 steps ahead of their treachery. "You did not come here today because you were worried about my health," I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a surgical blade. "You came here because the federal authorities have discovered the forged collateral. The banks know the signatures are fake, and the grand jury indictments are imminent. You are completely out of money. You are out of time. And you thought you could walk into this room, perform a pathetic theatrical act, and trick the foolish old man into bailing you out of a federal penitentiary." Justin slumped forward, resting his head in his hands. A raw, pathetic sob tore from his throat. Nicole was hyperventilating, her chest heaving, as she stared at the forged documents, confirming her absolute ruin. The facade of loving, affluent family was completely eradicated. There was no more manipulation. There were no more lies. There was only the brutal, terrifying reality of the consequences they had brought upon themselves. "For 7 years, I waited for you to show me a single ounce of genuine human decency," I told them, leaning back in my heavy leather chair. "I made excuses for your absence. I blamed myself for your coldness. But you were not just busy. You were sociopaths waiting for the perfect moment to strip away my dignity, my freedom, and my life. You tried to build a cage for me, Justin. But you were too arrogant to realize I was holding the keys the entire time." Wallace sat silently beside me, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to destroy my life. The room was filled with the sound of my children's pathetic weeping, but it brought me no joy and no sorrow. It was simply the sound of a closing chapter. The devastating reveal was complete. They finally knew exactly who they were dealing with, and they knew with absolute certainty that I was never going to save them. Panic, a raw and primal terror, completely consumed my children. Justin was the first to shatter. He let out a strange, choking gasp and stumbled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He grabbed his own hair, pulling at the roots as he began to pace frantically back and forth along the edge of the glass table. He was hyperventilating, taking short, jagged breaths that echoed in the quiet room. His chest heaved and sweat beaded on his pale forehead. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. Nicole remained frozen in her seat, but her entire body was shaking violently. Her eyes darted wildly between the forged loan documents and my stoic face. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, high-pitched whine escaped her throat. When the initial shock receded, the terror rapidly mutated into toxic, vicious survival instincts. They realized instantly that the only way to save themselves from a federal penitentiary was to find a scapegoat. The unity they had shared in plotting my demise evaporated in a fraction of a second. Justin stopped pacing and whirled around, pointing a trembling finger directly at his sister. "This is your fault," Justin screamed, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "You were the one who rushed the timeline. You were the one who said we needed the conservatorship before Christmas so you could pay off Brian's gambling debts. If you had just waited, if you had not pushed that corrupt doctor so hard, the old man would never have figured it out. You ruined everything, Nicole. You dragged me into this because your husband is a degenerate loser who owes money to violent criminals." Nicole leaped out of her chair, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. She slammed her hands down onto the glass table, glaring at her brother with absolute venom. "Do not you dare put this on me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply off the windowless walls. "You forged the signatures, Justin. You were the one who literally traced Dad's name onto those preliminary loan documents because your pathetic tech startup went completely bankrupt. Monica was threatening to leave you if you could not maintain your luxury lifestyle. It was Monica's and Brian's idea to use the house as collateral in the first place. You agreed to it. You masterminded the medical proxy. Do not act like you are an innocent victim here. You wanted his $8 million just as badly as we did. I watched them tear each other apart with a cold, detached fascination. They were hurling bitter accusations, exposing the deepest and darkest secrets of their marriages. They confirmed every single detail my private investigator had uncovered. Justin blamed Monica for her endless vanity and her demands for designer clothes and imported sports cars. Nicole screamed that Brian had single-handedly destroyed their lives by borrowing millions from offshore shadow syndicates. They stood in the middle of a prestigious law office, tearing down the polished, affluent facades they had spent their entire adult lives building. They looked absolutely pathetic. They were two hollow, greedy strangers fighting over the ashes of their own spectacular failures. The explosive argument raged for several agonizing minutes before the sheer exhaustion of their panic finally caught up with them. Justin suddenly stopped screaming. He looked down at the forged loan documents resting on the glass table, and the reality of the federal indictments hit him anew. He realized that arguing with Nicole would not stop the banking institutions from freezing his remaining assets. It would not stop the federal agents from kicking down his motel door. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The venom and rage drained completely from his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, pathetic desperation. He slowly walked around the edge of the glass table. His legs seemed to lose their strength, and he collapsed heavily onto his knees right beside my chair. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice reduced to a hoarse, pathetic whisper. "Dad, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. You have to help us. The federal prosecutors are building a massive case for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The private lenders are sending dangerous people to find us. We have absolutely nothing left. They repossessed my cars. Monica left me. I am sleeping in a cheap rented car. If you do not help me, I am going to go to federal prison for decades. I will not survive in there, Dad. Please, I am your son." Nicole saw her brother kneeling and immediately rushed over to join him. She sank to the floor beside my chair, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Dad," she sobbed, grabbing the sleeve of my suit jacket. We were desperate. Brian made terrible mistakes, and we panicked. We thought if we just borrowed the money using your estate, we could pay it back before you ever found out. We never actually wanted to hurt you. Please, Dad, you have $8 million resting in that offshore trust. You can pay off the loans. You can make the federal charges disappear. You can save our lives. We will do anything you want. We will take care of you. Just please do not let them take us away." They knelt on the hardwood floor, weeping and pleading for their lives. They were begging for the very same wealth they had tried to steal by locking me in a psychiatric cage. They were weaponizing their biology, using the titles of son and daughter as leverage to extract my mercy. Years ago, the sight of my children crying on the floor would have broken my heart into 1,000 pieces. I would have moved mountains to ease their pain. But looking down at them now, I felt absolutely nothing. The deep well of paternal love I used to carry for them had been completely drained and paved over with concrete. "You did not come to me for help when your businesses failed," I said, my voice flat and devoid of any emotional warmth. "You did not come to me and ask for a loan when your spouses drowned you in debt. You looked at the father who spent 40 years sacrificing his youth to give you a perfect life, and you saw a weak, vulnerable target. You actively conspired with corrupt doctors to declare me mentally incompetent. You planned to strip away my fundamental human rights, lock me in a sterile medical facility, and drug me into submission so you could steal my life savings. You are not apologizing because you feel remorse, Justin." I continued, looking directly into his hollow eyes. "You are apologizing because you got caught. You are crying because the federal authorities are about to strip away your freedom exactly the way you planned to strip away mine. You thought you were brilliant predators hunting a fragile old ghost, but you were just arrogant fools who walked blindly into a trap of your own making." "Family does not forge medical records to destroy a father's mind," I replied, my voice echoing with cold, absolute finality. You made your choices. You signed those fraudulent documents. You borrowed money from violent criminals to fund a luxury lifestyle you could not afford. Those debts belong entirely to you. The federal indictments belong entirely to you. I will not spend a single penny of my hard-earned wealth to save you from the inescapable consequences of your own malicious actions. You wanted my money so badly, you were willing to destroy my life for it. Now you have absolutely nothing, and you will face the full brutal weight of the law completely alone. They remained on the hardwood floor, staring up at me with faces entirely drained of color. The reality of my absolute rejection hung in the sterile air of the windowless conference room, pressing down on their shoulders like physical weights. Justin let out a low, pathetic wheeze, running his trembling hands through his unkempt hair, while Nicole simply sat paralyzed, her makeup completely ruined by her tears of terror. I did not offer them a single word of comfort. I simply turned my head and gave a slight, deliberate nod to Wallace, who had been sitting in total silence, recording every miserable detail of their collapse. My lawyer understood the signal perfectly. It was time to deliver the final killing blow. Wallace reached down to the floor and picked up his heavy leather briefcase, placing it squarely on the massive glass table. The loud click of the brass latches opening echoed sharply, causing both of my children to flinch. Wallace reached inside the briefcase and pulled out 2 thick manila folders, setting them gently on the smooth glass surface. He slid one folder toward Justin and the other toward Nicole. They looked at the closed folders as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. I instructed them to open the files. With shaking hands, Justin slowly flipped open the heavy cover, revealing dozens of pages packed with dense, complex legal text. These were not the fake conservatorship papers they had once tried to force upon me. These were bulletproof documents drafted by the most ruthless and meticulous corporate attorneys in the country. Wallace cleared his throat, his voice projecting a cold, professional detachment that commanded absolute attention. He began to explain the precise legal mechanisms we had engineered over the past 12 months. Wallace explained that the $8 million was no longer sitting in a personal brokerage account under my name. The portfolio had been liquidated and transferred into the irrevocable trust we established before I disappeared. The trust had been executed through independent administration, with records showing that I understood the transaction and made it voluntarily before any conservatorship order existed. Justin asked whether he could challenge it. Anyone can file a challenge, Wallace said. That does not make you a beneficiary. He turned to the governing instrument. The trust allowed distributions for my lifetime support. But Justin and Nicole had no right to demand money, direct investments, replace the trustee, or force assets back into the United States for their debts. The charitable remainder provision had been fixed when the trust was created. After my lifetime, the remaining corpus would pass to the foundation established to assist neglected and financially abused elderly people. That was the part that finally broke through their panic. The money they had treated as an inheritance was not waiting for them. It already had a destination. I leaned forward and told them why I chose it. For 7 years, I had learned what neglect felt like. During the final months before I disappeared, I learned something worse. What it felt like to realize your own children considered age and loneliness weaknesses they could exploit. I wanted my estate to help people who faced the same kind of pressure without the resources I had. The foundation would fund legal representation, emergency financial review, and protective services for older people facing coercive transfers, fraudulent powers of attorney, or abusive guardianship attempts. It was not designed to hunt families. It was designed to give vulnerable people competent help before someone else took control of their lives. Nicole stared at the trust summary. Justin asked whether there was an emergency family exception. There was not. He asked whether I could simply revoke the charitable remainder and give them the money. I could not. That was what irrevocable meant. Wallace then directed them to the final page of the folder, The estate documents confirming that neither child would receive a separate inheritance outside the trust. Any personal property remaining in my name at death would follow the same charitable plan. There was no dramatic curse buried in the paperwork, no secret punishment clause, just a deliberate estate plan executed by a competent adult who had decided that blood alone did not create a right to his property. Wallace had brought the original trust certification, the brokerage settlement records, and the foundation charter. Every date matched. Every transfer had been documented before I vanished. The children were not looking at a threat I might carry out someday. They were looking at decisions that had already become legally operative. Nicole began to weep again, resting her forehead against the cool glass table, mourning the total loss of her glamorous suburban lifestyle. Wallace was not finished. He instructed them to turn to the final page of their folders. It was a formal official notice of absolute permanent disinheritance. Wallace read the language aloud, ensuring they understood every single crushing word. The document stated that Justin and Nicole Bennett were entirely stripped of their status as my heirs. They were legally barred from claiming a single penny from my estate, whether I was living or deceased. They were completely and permanently cut off. The safety net they had taken for granted their entire lives had been deliberately set on fire and burned down to the ashes. They had absolutely nothing left. The violent offshore gambling syndicates were actively hunting Brian and holding Nicole responsible. The high-interest private lenders were preparing to destroy Justin for forging my signature on their collateral documents, and looming over all of this chaos was the immediate terrifying threat of the federal authorities who had fully uncovered their wire fraud and forgery. I looked at the two ruined strangers sitting across from me. They had aged decades in the span of 12 months. The sheer weight of their consequences was physically crushing them into the chairs. I felt a profound, immense sense of closure. The ghost that had haunted my empty house for 7 long years was finally laid to rest. I placed my hands flat on the table and slowly stood up, buttoning my charcoal suit jacket. My imposing figure cast a long, dark shadow across their ruined legal documents. "This meeting is officially over," I said, my voice steady, calm, and completely devoid of any paternal affection. "You have received the answers you begged for. You know exactly where my money is, and you know exactly why you will never see a single cent of it as long as you live. I strongly suggest you gather those documents and leave this building immediately." Justin looked up at me, his face shining with cold sweat. "Where are we supposed to go, Dad?" he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate sob. "We have absolutely nowhere to run. The federal agents are going to find us." I looked down at him with eyes as cold as a frozen ocean. "That is a problem you will have to solve on your own," Justin, I replied. "You built a cage for me to live in. Now it is time for you to go step into yours." I did not wait for them to respond. I turned my back on my biological children and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the conference room. I heard the scraping of their chairs as they slowly, painfully stood up to gather their useless paperwork. They were completely defeated, stripped of their arrogant illusions, and left with nothing but the terrifying reality of their impending arrest warrants. Wallace followed quietly behind me, leaving Justin and Nicole alone in the sterile, windowless room to face the absolute destruction of their own making. 8 months after the conference room meeting, a secure courier delivered a thick envelope from Wallace to my coastal bungalow. I was sitting on the porch with black coffee when I opened it. Inside were court records, sentencing summaries, forfeiture notices, and a short letter from Wallace. The federal case had finally reached its conclusion. The process had not moved like television. Justin and Nicole were indicted after investigators finished tracing the forged collateral documents, the communications with private lenders, and the false representations tied to my property and portfolio. Their cases moved through months of motions, financial reconstruction, and plea negotiations before the final judgments were entered. The central charges followed the scheme Wallace and I uncovered before I disappeared: federal wire fraud and forgery-related conspiracy, arising from the loans they tried to secure with assets they did not own, and signatures I never authorized. Justin tried to minimize his role. His lawyers argued that panic over a failing company drove him into decisions he never would have made under normal circumstances. The government answered with the loan records communications and the pattern of conduct surrounding the conservatorship attempt. The court did not accept financial desperation as permission to use a father's identity and property. Justin received a substantial multi-year federal prison sentence. Nicole's case followed the same basic path. She attempted to shift responsibility toward Justin and Brian, arguing that the gambling debts and the failing startup created pressure she could not control. But the documentary record showed that she participated in the plan to obtain authority over me, knew the collateral representations were false, and continued pursuing the scheme after the Thanksgiving call. She also received a substantial federal prison sentence. I read both summaries twice. Wallace had deliberately avoided dramatic language in his letter. He did not write that they had been destroyed. He wrote dates, charges, findings, restitution obligations, and sentence information. That was enough. The marriages collapsed before the criminal cases were finished. Monica filed for divorce from Justin once the money, reputation, and company disappeared. Whatever loyalty she claimed during the years of luxury did not survive insolvency and indictment. Brian disappeared from Nicole's life as his gambling creditors and financial problems closed around him. He left her to handle the consequences of the loans and the federal investigation without the affluent partnership she once defended so fiercely. The houses, cars, and status symbols that had made both families appear untouchable were gone. Foreclosure and civil recovery proceedings consumed what remained. Luxury vehicles were repossessed. Investment accounts were depleted. Property connected to the fraudulent debts was sold or surrendered through legal process. The social circles they once valued disappeared just as quickly. People who filled their holiday photos and expensive dinners stopped returning calls once every conversation involved lawyers, debt, or scandal. The material world Justin and Nicole had protected more fiercely than their relationship with me had proven temporary. Wallace's notes explained how the cases had separated the criminal conduct from the surrounding financial ruin. The creditors and banks pursued their own civil remedies. Federal prosecutors focused on the forged signatures, electronic transmissions, and the conspiracy to obtain control over assets that belonged to me. That separation made the outcome harder for Justin and Nicole to dismiss as one giant family argument. Different institutions had examined different parts of the same conduct and reached the same conclusion: the documents were false and the representations were deliberate. At sentencing, both children tried to describe themselves as people trapped by impossible circumstances. Justin pointed to the collapse of his startup and the pressure from lenders. Nicole pointed to Brian's gambling debts and the fear of losing her home. The judges considered those circumstances, but neither court treated them as excuses. Financial pressure might explain why someone becomes desperate. It does not authorize fraud. The records also showed that the Thanksgiving conversation became important evidence of intent. It did not prove every loan by itself, but it showed that the effort to isolate me and seek control over my estate was not an accidental paperwork mistake. The conversation fit the later conduct. That was the part I read most slowly. For 7 years, I had wondered whether I misunderstood my children. The courtroom record ended that question. Their own words had followed them all the way to judgment. The aftermath reached beyond prison terms. Justin's former company was dismantled through bankruptcy and creditor proceedings. Whatever viable technology remained was sold under court supervision instead of becoming the empire he once bragged about. Nicole's household assets were consumed by foreclosure debt claims and legal fees. Neither child retained the lifestyle that had made neglecting me seem so easy. I did not ask Wallace for photographs. I did not want to see them in handcuffs. I did not want courtroom sketches or prison intake pictures. Evidence had been necessary when they were trying to take my freedom. Spectacle was not necessary after they lost theirs. That distinction surprised me. A year earlier, I wanted them to feel the helplessness they had planned for me. By the time the cases ended, I no longer needed to watch. Consequences worked whether I stared at them or not. The envelope also contained a short update about the foundation created through my trust. That page mattered more to me than the sentencing records. The first grants had already gone to legal aid groups working with elderly people, facing coercive transfers, fraudulent powers of attorney, and family members trying to misuse guardianship proceedings for money. The fortune my children wanted to seize was now protecting people from schemes that looked painfully familiar. I set the criminal case summaries aside. For years, I believed closure would arrive as an emotional moment. I imagined anger burning away, or grief suddenly disappearing, or some final sentence from a judge making the past feel corrected. It did not happen that way. Closure was quieter. It was the understanding that their choices were no longer my responsibility. I had not sent Justin's startup into bankruptcy. I had not created Brian's gambling debts. I had not forged my own signature. I had not forced anyone to treat a conservatorship as a shortcut to an inheritance. They did those things. The legal system had simply reached the paperwork they left behind. I searched myself for pity. There was sadness in knowing that the two children Evelyn and I once raised had become people capable of planning something the cold. That sadness was real, but it was not the same as obligation. I did not owe them rescue because I remembered who they had been at 10 years old. I did not owe them my money because we shared blood, and I did not owe them access to the life I had rebuilt. I placed the court documents back into the envelope. I kept Wallace's one-page foundation report on the table. The ocean breeze moved across the porch and lifted one corner of the paper. 14 elderly clients had already received help during the foundation's first months. Some needed emergency legal representation. Others needed financial records untangled before relatives could take control. A few simply needed someone independent to believe them long enough to examine the facts. That was a legacy I understood. My children had wanted the $8 million because they saw it as an escape from consequences. I had turned it into a way for strangers to keep their own dignity. The difference told me everything I needed to know about the life I wanted from that point forward. I stood and walked down the porch steps toward the beach. The afternoon sun was beginning to fall toward the horizon. The water reflected orange and gold. I no longer pictured Justin and Nicole sitting in expensive restaurants or walking into holiday gatherings. Their lives had moved somewhere else, governed now by court orders and consequences I did not control. Mine was here. The next chapter did not belong to them. It belonged to the people who had shown up. The late afternoon sun hung low over the horizon, casting a brilliant path of golden light across the gentle rolling waves of the ocean. I sat comfortably in my favorite wooden rocking chair, on the porch of my coastal bungalow, feeling the salty breeze sweep across my face. A year ago, the very idea of this profound peace would have felt like an impossible dream. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the clean sea air fill my lungs. The oppressive, freezing winters of my past were gone forever. There was no more waiting by a silent telephone in a dark and empty brick house. I was no longer the forgotten father slowly fading into the shadows of his own grief. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my absolute freedom. The heavy chains of obligation to a family that only saw me as a target had been completely shattered, looking out at the endless expanse of blue water. I marveled at the incredible transformation of my own soul. For 7 agonizing years, I had allowed my biological children to dictate my self-worth. I had measured my value by their sparse text messages and their hollow excuses. I had let them turn me into a ghost in my own home. But as I sat there watching a pair of white seagulls glide effortlessly above the shoreline, I knew with absolute certainty that I was fully alive. I thought about my late wife, Evelyn. I knew she would be smiling down at me today, not because I had successfully punished our greedy children, but because I had finally learned how to live again. The offshore trust we had established was securing my legacy and aggressively protecting vulnerable people across the country. I did not need to hoard my wealth to feel powerful. I did not need to buy affection to feel loved. I had completely stripped away the toxic poison of my past, and from those bitter ashes I had built a foundation of undeniable strength. Justin and Nicole were exactly where they deserved to be, facing the severe federal consequences of their own malicious greed. I felt absolutely no pity for them and no lingering anger. They were simply a closed chapter in a very long and ultimately victorious book. The savory aroma of roasting garlic and fresh herbs drifted out through the open screen door of my bungalow, pulling me from my quiet reflections. I smiled and stood up from my rocking chair, my knees no longer aching the way they used to back in the cold city. It was time to get back into the kitchen. Tonight I was hosting a massive dinner party. But this was not the miserable, lonely Thanksgiving I had endured 12 months ago. I was not preparing a feast for ghosts who would never arrive. Tonight I was cooking for people who genuinely wanted to be here. I walked into my bright open kitchen and checked the massive roast sitting in the oven. The countertops were covered with fresh local vegetables, warm loaves of sourdough bread, and beautiful ceramic bowls filled with vibrant salads. Soft jazz music played quietly from a small radio in the corner, blending perfectly with the sound of the ocean tide outside. I moved around the kitchen with a joyful, rhythmic energy. There was no anxiety in my chest, no desperate hope that a car would suddenly pull into the driveway. I knew exactly who was coming, and I knew they were coming simply because they cared about me. Right on schedule. The sound of cheerful voices echoed up the wooden walkway leading to my porch. I wiped my hands on a clean kitchen towel and opened the front door to a chorus of warm, enthusiastic greetings. My old friend Wallace had flown down from the city just for the occasion, trading his stiff, tailored corporate suits for a comfortable linen shirt. He pulled me into a firm embrace, his eyes shining with profound, genuine happiness for the peaceful life I had built. Right behind him came the community center coordinator, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself. The retired mechanic walked in with a cooler of cold drinks, laughing at a joke Wallace had just told him. The local baker brought 2 handmade pies and set them carefully on the kitchen counter before giving me a warm hug. My small coastal bungalow was instantly filled with bright, echoing laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the beautiful, chaotic symphony of true friendship. We gathered around the large wooden dining table I had placed right in the center of the living room. The windows were pushed wide open, letting the soothing sound of the ocean waves provide the perfect background music for our meal. I looked around the table at the glowing, smiling faces, illuminated by the warm light of the overhead chandelier. We passed plates of roasted vegetables and carved meats, sharing stories and filling the room with a joyous energy. These people did not care about my past corporate empire or my hidden bank accounts. They knew me simply as George, the man who helped organize their food pantry and loved to fish on Tuesday mornings. Before we began to eat dessert, Wallace stood up and raised his glass high into the air. He looked directly at me, his expression filled with a deep, unspoken understanding of everything we had conquered together to get to this exact moment. To George, he said, his voice carrying a rich, booming warmth, to a man who proves that the best chapters of our lives are sometimes the ones we write completely from scratch, when the world thinks we are already finished. We all raised our glasses, and the sound of chiming crystal rang beautifully through the room. I took a sip of my drink, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude wash over my entire being. I looked at the community center coordinator laughing with the baker, and at the retired mechanic sharing a long fishing story with Wallace. In that perfect golden moment, the ultimate truth of my long journey crystallized in my mind. Blood does not make a family. Biology does not guarantee loyalty, respect, or basic human decency. True family is built on a solid foundation of shared kindness, mutual support, and unconditional respect. True family is chosen deliberately day after day, I had spent decades trying to force a connection with biological children who only saw me as a financial resource to be exploited. Now surrounded by people who loved me for my character alone, I realized I was richer than any billionaire on the entire planet. I had found the ultimate treasure that money could never buy. The vibrant dinner stretched late into the evening, filled with wonderful stories, delicious food, and endless joy. The air was thick with contentment, and the kind of easy, comfortable silence that only exists between true friends. When the final slice of pie was eaten, and the last guest had hugged me goodbye, I stood alone in my quiet living room. But the house did not feel empty in the slightest. It felt completely full of life and radiating absolute warmth. I walked back out onto the wooden porch and leaned heavily against the railing. Looking up at the magnificent canopy of bright silver stars scattered across the dark velvet sky. The cool night breeze rustled gently through the palm trees, and the tide rolled in, washing the sandy shoreline clean. I closed my eyes and smiled a deep, genuine smile that reached all the way to the very bottom of my soul. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a forgotten ghost, haunting an empty brick house waiting for scraps of affection. My 7-year nightmare was permanently and flawlessly laid to rest. I was finally truly and completely at peace, looking back on this agonizing chapter of my life. The most profound lesson I learned is that blind trust is a luxury you cannot afford, even with those who share your blood. We are conditioned to believe that family will inherently protect us and that the sacrifices we make for our children will automatically yield loyalty and love. But morality is a daily choice, not a genetic guarantee. When absolute greed infects a heart, it strips away all familial bonds, leaving behind nothing but ruthless opportunism. I learned that you must never ignore your own intuition just to preserve a fragile illusion of peace. Setting firm boundaries and demanding strict accountability are the truest forms of self-respect. Sometimes the most agonizing betrayal becomes the exact catalyst you need to reclaim your power, teaching you that your legacy and your